The Justice Court of Miami was unrecognizable that Monday morning. The large colonial windows that usually let in just enough tropical light could barely contain the incessant flashes of cameras. Reporters from across the country crowded the marble hallways, their voices forming a constant buzz as microphones were adjusted and cameras strategically positioned. At the center of this media storm, Jessica Taylor adjusted her tie with the same methodical precision she applied to her algorithms. At 22, she had already become a legend in academic circles at the Florida Institute of Technology. The daughter of an American university professor and a Brazilian computer scientist, Jessica had grown up surrounded by codes and calculations, nurturing a mind that seemed to know no bounds. "Are you ready?" The deep voice of Marcus Peterson, her lawyer, brought her back to reality. Older, with graying hair at his temples and thin-framed glasses, he carried a worn leather briefcase that contrasted with the ultra-modern tablet Jessica held against her chest. "I was born ready, Marcus," she replied quickly, her voice a perfect blend of accents that betrayed her bicultural upbringing. "It's them who aren't prepared for me." The lawyer smiled, but his eyes revealed concern. "Remember, we're not just facing people, Jessica. We're challenging an entire system with centuries of tradition. A flawed system, Marcus, a system that needs to evolve." The large wooden door opened, and the buzz instantly grew louder. Jessica took a deep breath and entered the courtroom, where Judge Elizabeth Rocha already occupied her elevated seat. With over 3 decades of experience, Elizabeth was known for her impartiality and sharp intellect. Her eyes observed the young woman walking down the central aisle with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The case about to begin was unprecedented in the American judicial system. Jessica had developed an algorithm dubbed Digital Scales, capable of analyzing thousands of court decisions and identifying patterns of inconsistency based on factors like race, social class, and gender. The program not only exposed unconscious biases in sentences, but also suggested corrections based on constitutional principles. The problem began when Jessica's program revealed alarming discrepancies in cases considered models, identical cases with drastically different sentences, decisions influenced by factors unrelated to the law. When these results were published in a scientific journal, chaos erupted in legal circles across the country. It was Richard Coleman, a federal judge who had lived in the US for decades and was a visiting professor at the university, who saw the revolutionary potential of this technology. Through his influence, he managed to get the Supreme Court to consider implementing the system as an auxiliary tool in the judiciary. But the resistance was immediate and fierce. And now there was Jessica, facing a packed courtroom ready to defend her creation. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elizabeth Rocha," announced the bailiff, and silence finally settled in the room. Elizabeth adjusted her glasses and reviewed the documents before her before speaking. "We are here to evaluate the proposal to implement the Digital Scales system as an auxiliary tool in the American judicial system. Ms. Jessica Taylor will present the arguments in favor, while Dr. Carlos Mendonza will represent the Judges Association." She paused significantly. "Before we begin, I want to make it clear that this is not an ordinary trial. We are here to discuss ideas, not crimes." Jessica nodded, grateful for the openness. But her calm was shattered when Carlos Mendonza stood up. Tall, impeccably dressed in an Italian suit, he was known for his impeccable oratory and his fierce resistance to any kind of change in the system. "Your Honor," he began, his melodious voice filling the room, "before Ms. Taylor presents her innovation, I would like to question the very premise of this proceeding. How can we consider replacing human judgment, developed through years of study and experience, with a machine?" Jessica felt her blood boil, but she maintained her composure. Marcus had warned her about this tactic, to distort the purpose before she could even explain it. "With all due respect," Marcus interrupted, standing up, "no one is proposing to replace judges with machines. The system is an auxiliary tool, nothing more." Elizabeth gestured for Carlos to sit down. "Dr. Mendonza, let's allow Ms. Taylor to explain her system before questioning its validity." Jessica thanked her with a nod and walked to the center of the room. She connected her tablet to the projection system and the screens around the courtroom lit up with graphs and statistics. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite her youth, "what I bring today is not a threat to justice, but a promise of improvement. Digital scales does not replace human judgment. It complements it, revealing patterns that may go unnoticed, even by the most trained eyes." As she spoke, the graphs showed alarming disparities. Harsher sentences for black defendants compared to white defendants for the same crime. Differences in treatment based on socio-economic status, inconsistencies in interpretations of the same law by different judges. "Our legal system is one of the most advanced in the world," Jessica continued, "but it is still operated by human beings, subject to unconscious biases and external pressures. What I propose is a tool that helps minimize these variables, ensuring that the law is applied more uniformly and fairly." The impact of her presentation was visible on the faces around the room. Some magistrates whispered among themselves, others took furious notes. Elizabeth maintained a neutral expression, but her eyes didn't leave the projected graphs. Carlos Mendonça, however, didn't seem impressed. When Jessica finished her initial presentation, he stood up again, this time with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive, Ms. Taylor, truly impressive, but I have a simple question. Where did this data come from? How did you access confidential information from so many cases?" The murmur in the room grew louder. It was a veiled accusation of unethical, perhaps even illegal conduct. Jessica felt all eyes on her, some now filled with suspicion. The young woman remained calm, though her heart raced. This was just the first of many battles she would have to face that day, and the war for the evolution of justice was just beginning. The silence in the courtroom was almost palpable as Jessica calmly walked to her table. Everyone waited for her response to Carlos Mendonça's veiled accusation. Instead of showing indignation, she smiled as if she had expected this blow. "All the data used in the development of digital scales is public domain," Jessica explained, her clear and confident voice echoing through the room. With a few taps on her tablet, she projected a new set of documents on the screen. Each case analyzed was taken from the official Journal of Justice, with personal information properly anonymized. Nothing illegal, nothing unethical. She made a strategic pause, her eyes scanning the courtroom before fixing on Carlos. "In fact, Dr. Mendonça, this transparency is precisely one of the pillars of my system, something that seems to bother those who prefer certain inconsistencies to remain in the shadows." A murmur of approval swept through the assembly. Elizabeth Rocha gestured for her to continue. "Moreover," Jessica continued, "the complete source code is available for analysis by any expert the court designates. There are no black boxes, no secret algorithms. Everything can be verified and validated." Carlos seemed uncomfortable with the answer, but quickly recomposed himself. "Very well, Ms. Taylor, but the fundamental question remains. Justice is not mathematics. How does your system intend to capture the human nuances of each case, the mitigating circumstances, the social context?" It was the cue Jessica had been waiting for. With a fluid motion, she projected a new set of data. "The system does not ignore nuances, Dr. Mendonça. In fact, it identifies them with much greater precision." On the screen appeared two cases side by side, with identical circumstances but drastically different sentences. How do you explain that in these situations? With the same aggravating and mitigating factors, the decisions were so discrepant. The only visible difference is the defendant's neighborhood of origin. Carlos's face reddened slightly. One of the cases was his. It was at that moment that the courtroom door opened and all heads turned. Richard Coleman entered, leaning on a polished wooden cane. At 68, the American judge had a presence that commanded immediate respect. Having lived in the US for over 2 decades, he had become a respected figure in American and international legal circles. "I apologize for the delay, Your Honor," he said, addressing Elizabeth with a slight bow of his head. The judge indicated a seat in the front row. "The court appreciates your presence, Dr. Coleman. Your experience will be valuable in this discussion." Jessica couldn't hide her smile. Richard had been her mentor in recent years, the first to truly believe in the potential of digital scales. His presence there was a silent but powerful support. Carlos, however, seemed even more uncomfortable. With all due respect to Dr. Coleman, his partiality in this case is well known. He has been a vocal supporter of this experiment. Richard smiled serenely. I am a supporter of justice, Dr. Mendonza, in whatever form it presents itself. Elizabeth intervened before the debate could derail. Let's continue with Ms. Taylor's presentation. Dr. Mendonza, you will have your time to counter-argue. Jessica resumed her explanation, now with even more confidence. Digital Scales not only identifies inconsistencies, but also learns from each new case analyzed. It adapts, evolves. It is a living system, just like our laws and our society. It was at that moment that a new voice was heard in the courtroom. Samantha Williams, a renowned expert in digital ethics who was in the audience, stood up. Your Honor, if I may, I would like to make a technical observation. Elizabeth considered for a moment before nodding. Proceed, Dr. Williams. As an expert who has examined Ms. Taylor's system, I can confirm that there is something that has not yet been mentioned here. Samantha walked to the center of the courtroom, the click of her heels echoing in the expectant silence. The algorithm not only identifies past patterns, it is capable of predicting future trends based on those patterns. A murmur of astonishment swept through the room. Jessica shot a surprised look at Marcus, who seemed equally intrigued. This was a functionality that had been developed recently, but was not included in the official presentation. What exactly does that mean? Elizabeth asked, leaning forward, clearly interested. It means, Your Honor, that the system can alert when a decision is about to be made following a pattern identified as inconsistent. Samantha made a dramatic pause. In other words, it can prevent injustices before they even occur. The courtroom erupted in agitated conversations. Carlos immediately stood up, protesting against what he called an unacceptable invasion of judicial autonomy. But Elizabeth silenced him with a firm gesture. Ms. Taylor, is this predictive functionality part of your original proposal? Jessica hesitated for only a second. It's a recent development, Your Honor, still in the experimental phase. And how did you obtain the data to train this predictive aspect of the system? The question came from one of the magistrates present, a middle-aged man with a skeptical expression. Jessica exchanged a quick glance with Richard, who nodded imperceptibly. The data came from simulations based on the historical patterns identified, she replied. But also, she paused, knowing that what she would say next could complicate her situation even further. We also used ongoing cases, anonymized of course, to verify the accuracy of the predictions. The silence that followed was heavy. Using ongoing cases, even anonymized, was entering murky territory. Carlos wasted no time in capitalizing. Your Honor, this is inadmissible. Interfering in ongoing cases goes against all ethical and legal principles of our system. Elizabeth raised her hand, calling for silence. Ms. Taylor, are you aware of the implications of what you just revealed? Jessica took a deep breath before answering. I am, Your Honor, but no information was altered, no case was interfered with. We merely observed, compared with the system's predictions, and documented the results, and they were revealing. The tension in the air was almost physical when the courtroom door opened again. A man in a dark suit entered and handed an envelope to Marcus, who quickly opened it. His face visibly paled. Your Honor, he said, standing up, I have just received information that may be relevant to this case. Elizabeth frowned. What kind of information, Dr. Peterson? Marcus hesitated, looking at Jessica, who seemed as surprised as everyone else. Information about the true motive behind the resistance to implementing digital scales. Carlos stood up abruptly. This is absurd, a desperate maneuver to divert attention from Ms. Taylor's unethical actions. Elizabeth banged the gavel, restoring order. Dr. Peterson, unless this information is directly relevant to the technical and ethical question of the system under discussion, I don't see how it can be admitted at this time. Marcus adjusted his glasses, a surprising calm on his face. Now, It is extremely relevant, Your Honor, because it reveals that certain members of the Judges Association have a personal interest in preventing this system from seeing the light of day. The entire courtroom held its breath. Jessica looked at Richard, who seemed as surprised as she was. Something was happening there, something that wasn't part of the original plan. And for the first time since she entered that courtroom, Jessica Taylor felt she no longer had control over the events. Elizabeth studied Marcus for long seconds before making her decision. Very well, Dr. Peterson. The court will hear this new information. She looked at the clock on the wall. But not now. We will take a 1-hour recess. When we return, I expect everyone to be prepared for an even franker discussion. With a bang of the gavel, the session was suspended, leaving an atmosphere charged with anticipation and tension. As those present stood up, Jessica quickly approached Marcus. What information is this? Why didn't you tell me anything? Marcus looked around, making sure they wouldn't be overheard. Because I only found out myself just now, and believe me, Jessica, this changes everything. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with whispered conversations. At a corner table, Jessica, Marcus, and Richard formed an unlikely trio, leaning over documents spread on the polished wooden surface. How did you get this? Jessica asked, still absorbing the contents of the papers in front of her. Marcus adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit that intensified in moments of tension. Amber Johnson, the investigative journalist from the Miami Herald, she's been investigating Judge Mendonza for months. And he knew about this? Richard asked, his American voice carrying a slight southern accent acquired from decades living in Miami. Apparently not. Amber kept everything secret until she was absolutely sure. Marcus pointed to a specific document. This changes everything. Jessica studied the papers with growing indignation. The documents revealed that Carlos Mendonza wasn't just opposing digital scales on legal principles. He had much more personal motives. Over the past 5 years, the judge had issued dozens of rulings favoring companies linked to his brother-in-law, Lucas Montgomery, an American businessman living in the US, a clear pattern that any analysis algorithm would easily identify. That's why he's so desperate to stop the system from being implemented, Jessica concluded, feeling a mix of triumph and disgust. He knows he'd be one of the first to be exposed. Richard sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. This explains why the resistance has been so fierce. It's not just Carlos. There are others with similar skeletons in their closets. The question now is, how do we use this? Marcus looked around, aware of the curious glances they were receiving. Elizabeth is known for her integrity, but exposing a colleague publicly— We don't need to expose him directly, Jessica interrupted, an idea forming in her mind. We can use the data itself. Let digital scales speak for itself. The return to the courtroom was marked by a different silence, no longer one of expectation, but of tense anticipation. Carlos Mendonza sat rigidly in his seat, his face a mask of forced composure. Beside him, several other magistrates from the association seemed equally uncomfortable. Elizabeth Rocha observed the room before banging the gavel, restarting the session. Dr. Peterson, the court is ready to hear the information you mentioned. Before the recess, Marcus stood up holding a thin folder. Your Honor, after careful consideration, we have decided not to present these specific documents. A murmur of surprise swept through the room. Carlos barely managed to hide his relief. Instead, we would like to make a practical demonstration of digital scales. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. Proceed, Dr. Peterson. Jessica stood up and walked to the center of the room, tablet in hand. With the court's permission, I would like to show how the system works in real time, analyzing public cases and identifying patterns. After Elizabeth's approval, Jessica connected her tablet to the projection system again. The screens around the courtroom lit up with a clean and intuitive interface. I'll input basic parameters: civil cases, Miami metropolitan area, last 5 years. Her fingers slid confidently across the screen. Now, let's ask the system to identify patterns of rulings favoring companies in the real estate sector. Carlos visibly squirmed in his seat. Other magistrates exchanged apprehensive glances. In seconds, the system compiled the data and presented the results, a clear graph showing how certain judges, including Carlos Mendonça, consistently favored specific companies. No names were explicitly mentioned, but the patterns were undeniable. As you can see, Jessica continued, her calm voice contrasting with the palpable tension in the room, the system doesn't accuse anyone. It merely reveals statistical patterns that deserve attention. The interpretation of these patterns is up to humans, to judges, lawyers, society. Elizabeth leaned forward, clearly intrigued. And what happens when a new case comes to the court? How does the system behave? Jessica smiled, grateful for the question. Let's simulate. She entered the data of a hypothetical case, similar to those Carlos had ruled on in the past. The system processed the information and displayed an alert. Inconsistent pattern detected. Review recommended. That's all the system does. It alerts, recommends a more careful review. The final decision remains with the judge. A reflective silence took over the courtroom. Even Carlos seemed speechless in the face of the elegance of the solution. It was Samantha Williams who broke the silence, standing up again. "If I may, Your Honor, I would like to compliment Ms. Taylor's demonstration." With Elizabeth's approval, Samantha joined Jessica in the center of the room. As an independent expert who has analyzed this system, I can confirm that it not only identifies past patterns, but also constantly evolves, learning from new decisions. She made a significant pause. In other words, like our legal system, it is not static. It is alive, adaptable, reflective. The metaphor didn't go unnoticed. Several magistrates who had seemed skeptical now showed genuine interest. Carlos, sensing the shift in the room, made one last attempt. "All of this is very impressive, but we're still talking about a machine trying to understand what is essentially human: justice, fairness, compassion." Jessica looked directly at him. "Dr. Mendonça, the system doesn't try to understand these concepts. It merely reflects how we, humans, apply them in practice. If the patterns it reveals are inconsistent or unjust, perhaps the problem isn't with the mirror but with the image it reflects." A murmur of approval swept through the courtroom. Elizabeth banged the gavel softly, restoring order. "I believe we've all had much to reflect on today," the judge said, her gaze sweeping the room. "Before concluding this session, I would like to hear from Dr. Coleman, whose support for this project has been instrumental." Richard stood up with some effort, leaning on his cane. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, I have spent nearly 50 years serving justice in 2 different countries. I have seen legal systems evolve, adapt to new realities. What Jessica Taylor presents to us today is not a threat to legal tradition. It is its natural evolution." He paused, looking directly at Carlos. "Resisting change out of fear of the unknown is human. Resisting it out of fear of exposing our own flaws is understandable. But it is our duty as guardians of justice to constantly seek its improvement, even when that means looking critically at our own decisions." Richard's speech resonated with many in the room. Even some of the most resistant magistrates now seemed thoughtful, perhaps re-evaluating their positions. Elizabeth Rocha observed the courtroom for long moments before speaking. "This is not a decision that can or should be made hastily. What we have seen today raises profound questions about the nature of justice and how it is administered in our society." She looked directly at Jessica. "Ms. Taylor, your system is remarkable not only for its technical sophistication, but for its fundamental proposition: to make visible what often remains hidden, even to those who sincerely seek justice." Turning to Carlos and the other magistrates, she continued, "Resistance to new ideas is a natural part of the scientific and social process. Questions are necessary, skepticism is healthy. But when those questions are motivated by fear of transparency, we must reflect on what we are truly defending." The entire courtroom hung on her words. Elizabeth adjusted her glasses before continuing. "Therefore, my decision is that digital scales be implemented as a pilot project in 5 courthouses in the Miami metropolitan area for an initial period of 6 months. During this time, an independent commission of experts in law, ethics, and technology will evaluate its results and impacts. She looked directly at Carlos. And to ensure the complete impartiality of this process, no magistrate with cases identified by the system as potentially inconsistent will participate in the evaluation commission. A murmur of approval swept through the room. Jessica could barely contain her emotion. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start, a powerful start. Elizabeth banged the gavel one last time. This session is adjourned. As people began to disperse, Jessica was surrounded by enthusiastic journalists and colleagues. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, proud. "You did it, Jessica. You really did it." Richard approached slowly, a serene smile on his wrinkled face. "This is just the beginning, my dear. The real battle begins now, making this system not only work, but transform justice for the better." Jessica nodded, aware of the responsibility she now carried. Her gaze met Carlos Mendonza's, who watched her from across the room. For a fleeting moment, she didn't see hostility in his eyes, but something like reluctant respect. Perhaps, just perhaps, even the most resistant could eventually see the value of evolution. As she left the courthouse alongside Marcus and Richard, under the glare of camera flashes, Jessica Taylor knew she had just changed the course of American legal history. And this was only the first page of a new era of justice.